You have probably felt it, this strange, quiet power inside you. The one that doesn't roar, doesn't demand, doesn't beg to be understood, yet still pulses beneath your skin like a secret you haven't found the courage to name. You walk through the world carrying thoughts that feel heavier than your voice, observing the unseen threads between people, listening to the stories they never say out loud, sensing the tension behind smiles, the exhaustion behind laughter, the longing behind silence. And as you notice these hidden layers, something in you begins to awaken, like a lantern, flickering to life in a dark hallway, where most people keep their eyes closed. And so, the question forms, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly in the back of your mind. Why do some people feel the world more deeply? Why do some carry storms no one else can see? Why do the strongest ones speak the least, explain the least, rely on the least? You've met them, maybe you've been one of them, the person who walks away instead of arguing, the one who chooses silence over justification, the one who knows what they know, but does not need the world to bow in agreement. That kind of strength is strange, almost invisible, because it does not perform. It simply is, like a mountain unbothered by the wind, or the ocean unmoved by a single stone thrown into its depths. And yet, this quiet strength carries its own paradox. The more you see, the harder it becomes to speak. The deeper you understand, the less you feel the need to prove, and the wiser you become, the more you realize how little control you have over anyone else's perception. And so, the hook slips into your mind. What if explaining yourself is not a sign of clarity, but a sign of insecurity? What if your silent knowing is already enough? What if the world's misunderstanding of you is not your burden to fix? Picture this. You walk into a room filled with chatter, laughter, noise, and yet something inside you remains unmoved. You see people trying to impress each other, trying to mold themselves into shapes that fit the expectations around them, trying to use words to justify their choices, their feelings, their wounds. But there is a part of you that steps back, that watches, that sees through the layers as though they are transparent glass. And for a fleeting moment, you wonder, am I the quiet one because I am weak, or because I am finally strong enough not to need approval? And this question lingers like smoke curling in the air as we move into the illusion of everyday life, where most people wander unaware of the roles they're playing, unaware of the masks they've glued to their own faces, unaware that they are dancing to a rhythm they never chose, performing lives they never questioned. But you, yes, you have begun to feel the cracks between those illusions, the subtle tremble in the world's facade, the faint whisper that says, there is more, you are seeing more. And that is both a gift and a weight. So let us walk deeper now, into the places where awareness becomes a burden, where strength becomes misunderstood, where silence becomes a misunderstood language. Follow me into the everyday illusions, where you will begin to see why explaining yourself is a cage you no longer need to live inside, and why those who carry true strength rarely speak to defend their truth, because they no longer need the world to echo back what they already know. So you step into the rhythm of ordinary life, and suddenly the illusion becomes clearer to you than ever before, the way people move, speak, react, defend themselves, apologize for existing, and anchor their worth to the approval in someone else's eyes. And you realize something quietly tragic. Most people are not living, they're performing. Watch closely the next time you're at a social gathering, everyone laughing just a little too loudly, everyone trying just a little too hard to be interesting, everyone curating their stories like fragile artifacts meant to impress an imaginary judge. Someone tells a joke they don't find funny, but they force a smile to avoid awkwardness. Another person nods along to a conversation they don't care about, just to seem agreeable. And somewhere in the corner, someone who feels deeply out of place rehearses their next sentence in their head because silence makes them feel inferior. The entire room is filled with people explaining themselves without even realizing it. They explain, through their posture, through their tone, through their desperate attempts to be accepted, through the way they shrink their truth to fit inside someone else's comfort. And you stand there, watching, realizing that most of life is a quiet audition for approval, a constant justification of one's existence. You see the illusion at work, in workplaces too, colleagues who pretend to be busier than they are just to look valuable, employees who over-explain simple decisions because they fear being judged, managers who dress their insecurities in authority, and even the confident ones who never stop talking because silence would expose the trembling beneath their performance. You notice the illusion in families, where people hide their true feelings behind tradition, where parents defend outdated expectations, where children shrink themselves to avoid disappointing someone, where love is often diluted with fear and duty, and where no one dares to speak their truth without offering a long explanation afterward, as if honesty itself requires permission. You see the illusion in relationships too, partners who apologize for their needs, who over-explain their emotions just to be heard, who justify their boundaries as though protecting their peace is an inconvenience, and who try to mold themselves into palatable shapes because they fear that being fully known means being unloved. Most of the world is trapped in this exhausting cycle of explaining and over-explaining, seeking validation from people who are themselves drowning in doubt. And yet, there you are, observing it all, feeling the tension between what is real and what is performed, sensing the unease beneath the surface, and quietly realizing that you do not want to live in this illusion anymore. But awareness is a strange thing. It does not come gently. It arrives like a soft earthquake, shifting the ground beneath your feet, making everything around you feel slightly off balance. As you begin to understand the illusion, you also begin to see your own habits reflected in it. Every moment you once explained yourself, every time you gave a speech to defend your truth, every time you shrank your voice so someone else could feel comfortable, every time you justified a decision that needed no justification, and the realization strikes. Explaining yourself is often just a way of asking for permission to be who you already are. But strong people, those who have walked through enough fire, felt enough loneliness, survived enough storms, learn a different language, the language of quiet certainty. They learn that truth does not need applause, that peace does not require approval, and that the moment you stop performing, you begin to live. This awareness grows inside you, subtle but undeniable, as though a new pair of eyes has opened within you, seeing the world not as it appears, but as it truly is. And yet, with this awakening comes a quiet tension, a sense that the more you see, the less you can unsee, and the more illusions you recognize, the harder it is to play along. You start to feel like the only sober person in a room full of people pretending to be drunk, the only one hearing a faint melody beneath the noise, the only one conscious of a truth no one else dares to acknowledge. You begin to stand out not because you want to, but because awareness naturally sets you apart. This is the beginning of something deeper, something more poetic and painful. The moment when you start to wake up from the illusion everyone else is still comfortably dreaming inside. And that awakening, beautiful as it is, carries its own weight, its own loneliness, its own quiet transformation that leads you directly into the next phase, the moment of realization that forever changes the way you move through the world. And then it happens not in a dramatic flash of lightning, not in some cinematic epiphany, but in a quiet moment when you least expect it. The awakening, the shift, the soft crack in the shell you've been living inside your whole life. Maybe it happens while you're standing alone in the kitchen late at night, staring at the glow of the refrigerator light. Or while you're sitting in your car after a long day, letting the silence settle in your bones. Or while listening to someone talk and suddenly you hear, not their words, but the sadness behind them. Whatever the moment looks like, the effect is the same. Something inside you finally clicks into place, and you see the world with a clarity that feels both liberating and terrifying. You see how much of your life has been lived in reaction, reacting to expectations, reacting to pressure, reacting to other people's opinions, reacting to assumptions that were never yours to carry in the first place. You see how often you tried to justify your actions, your dreams, your desires, as though your existence needed footnotes. And there, in that inner stillness, you realize a truth so simple and yet so rare. You don't need to explain yourself to be valid. Your heart doesn't need a permission slip. Your boundaries don't need a PowerPoint presentation. Your feelings don't need a courtroom defense. You begin to see that explaining yourself has been a quiet form of self-doubt, a subtle confession that you still believe other people hold authority over your worth. But in this awakening, something shifts. You reclaim that authority. You feel the first spark of inner strength rise inside you. Not loud, not aggressive, but steady, like a candle that refuses to go out even in the wind. And as this strength grows, so does your awareness, not just of yourself, but of others. You start noticing the patterns more sharply. How people weaponize misunderstanding to maintain control. How they twist silence into guilt. How they demand explanations not because they need clarity, but because they want dominance. You see manipulation disguised as concern, entitlement disguised as curiosity, judgment disguised as conversation. And suddenly, you no longer feel compelled to play along. This awakening is not comfortable. It isolates you from the familiar. It forces you to confront the ways you've abandoned yourself, trying to be understood. It demands honesty, the kind that shakes your foundations. You might feel a sudden distance from the people you once felt close to, realizing that some relationships were built not on connection, but on compliance. You might feel your voice getting quieter, not out of fear, but because you no longer waste your breath on explanations that fall on unwilling ears. You might feel your presence becoming sharper, more defined, more rooted. People start to sense the shift even before you speak. Your silence becomes heavier, clearer, more intentional. And this is where the tension deepens. Awareness brings power, but it also brings distance. You start to see through facades so easily that it becomes harder to pretend, harder to play the games everyone else plays, harder to stay blind when your eyes have finally opened. You recognize when someone is projecting their insecurities onto you. You recognize when someone is fishing for a reaction. You recognize when someone is trying to pull you into a conversation where you're expected to defend your existence. And instead of explaining yourself, you let the moment pass. Instead of arguing, you simply withdraw. Instead of proving your intentions, you trust them quietly. And that, silence. Your silence becomes stronger than any explanation could ever be. But with this strength comes an ache, a subtle isolation. A feeling that the more awakened you become, the fewer people can meet you at that depth. And that ache will lead you into the next chapter of your journey, the chapter where clarity becomes loneliness, where strength becomes separation, and where seeing too much sometimes feels like a burden you carry alone. That is where we must go next, into the quiet landscape of isolation. And now you enter the part no one warns you about the isolation. The quiet distance that forms not because you shut the world out, but because you finally see it too clearly. Awareness, though beautiful, has a weight to it, a cold edge, a quiet echo that follows you even in crowded rooms. And as you begin to shed the old habit of explaining yourself, you also begin shedding the people who depended on that version of you. Suddenly the world feels different, not hostile, not cruel, just distant. As if you're standing behind a pane of invisible glass. You can see everyone, hear everyone, understand everyone, but they cannot quite reach you anymore. You notice the conversations that used to feel comfortable now feel hollow. The jokes that once made you laugh now feel forced. The friendships that relied on your over-explaining start to loosen like threads pulled from worn fabric. It isn't that you no longer care, it's that you can no longer pretend. You find yourself speaking less, listening more, observing the unspoken dynamics between people with a clarity that feels almost intrusive. You see when someone lies to themselves. You see when someone postures. You see when someone seeks validation through noise. And with every new layer of truth revealed, the space between you and the world stretches a little wider. This isolation is not loneliness, not at first. It feels like a deep inward pull, a retreat into yourself, a desire to protect your awakening from the noise of the old world. But slowly, inevitably, the ache begins to grow. Because when you see too deeply, when you feel too sharply, when you no longer need to explain yourself, you also begin to realize how few people know how to meet you in that space of quiet confidence. You become the person others come to for advice, but never truly understand. You become the listener, the anchor, the steady presence, but who anchors you? You feel this especially with the people closest to you, the family member who interprets your silence as disrespect, the friend who mistakes your boundaries for distance, the partner who feels threatened by your newfound clarity. They ask questions not to understand you, but to pull you back into the version of you they were comfortable with. Why are you so quiet? Why don't you tell me everything anymore? Why are you acting different? And you try at first to explain, to reassure, to offer comforting words that no longer fit the compo shape of your truth. But the more you explain, the more you feel yourself shrinking again. And eventually, you stop, not out of anger, but because you realize explanation has become a language you no longer speak. Somewhere in this emotional solitude, you begin to feel the deeper weight of awareness, being misunderstood by people you once thought would understand you effortlessly. You watch them misread your silence as coldness, your boundaries as rejection, your calmness as indifference. And the strange thing is, you could correct them. You could justify. You could soften yourself to ease their discomfort, but you don't. Because something in you knows that those who truly see you require no explanation, and those who demand one would not believe it no matter how gently you offered it. So you walk further into the landscape of isolation, where your clarity becomes your cloak and your silence your companion. And in that quiet space, you notice something else. The world around you begins revealing its hidden stories. You become acutely aware of the person who avoids eye contact because they fear being truly seen. You notice the one who talks endlessly because silence terrifies them. You notice the one who constantly seeks reassurance because their worth is stitched to the outside world. You see their pain, their fear, their masks, their searching. And in that seeing, you feel a tenderness, a deep empathy, because you've walked that path too. But empathy does not erase isolation. It deepens it. Because now you can feel the emotional weight behind every gesture, every word, every hesitation, and like a person who sees the whole ocean while everyone else sees only the waves, you begin to feel the burden of knowing too much. And the more you see, the more alone you feel in that seeing. This is the paradox of inner strength. You grow, you rise, you transform, but the path becomes narrower, quieter, and lonelier. And yet, within this isolation, something else begins to form an inner conflict, a question that tugs at your mind. Should you speak or stay silent? Should you guide or allow people to remain in their illusions? Should you intervene when you see someone hurting themselves with their own patterns, or should you simply observe? This moral tension begins stirring inside you, pulling you into the next chapter of your journey, the conflict between awareness and involvement, truth and peace, intervention and understanding. And it is there, in that inner battle, where the next transformation begins. And so you arrive at the quiet battlefield within yourself, the conflict, the inner tug of war that begins the moment you realize you see more than others are ready to confront, the moment your silence becomes not just a shield, but a mirror that reflects the truth people would rather avoid. You start to feel the tension of knowing when to intervene and when to walk away, when to speak and when to let your silence speak for you, when to offer clarity and when to let misunderstandings dissolve on their own. Because here's the paradox you begin to wrestle with. Awareness gives you power, but it also gives you responsibility. And responsibility, when felt too deeply, can become its own quiet torment. You watch someone repeat a harmful pattern, blaming everyone but themselves, and you feel an urge to step in, to say, I see what you're doing, and I understand why, but something stops you. You know that truth offered to a person who isn't ready will sound like judgment, advice will sound like attack, and clarity will sound like arrogance. You watch someone manipulate a situation, twisting words to paint themselves innocent while casting shadows on others, and a part of you wants to expose the truth, to bring light into the room, but you also know that people who cling to illusions will always resent the one who shatters them. So you hold your tongue. Not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because you begin to understand a deeper truth. Explaining yourself, revealing your insight, exposing your wisdom. It is not your duty. You do not exist to rescue people from the illusions they built to protect themselves. You do not exist to defend your perspective to those who benefit from misunderstanding you. You do not exist to justify the truth that your soul already knows. And yet, this restraint is not peaceful, not at first. It stirs something sharp inside you, a frustration born not from anger, but from compassion. You want to help, but you know you cannot force awareness onto others. You want to guide, but you know guidance without readiness becomes intrusion. You want to protect, but you know protection offered too early becomes control. This conflict grows even stronger within your relationships. Someone accuses you of being distant, when in reality, you are simply choosing peace. Someone demands that you justify your boundaries, as though your well-being is a burden they must approve. Someone projects their fears onto you, shaping you into the villain in a story you never agreed to be part of. And you stand there, feeling the weight of their misunderstanding pressing against your silence. It would be easy to explain yourself, to defend your intentions, to clear your name, to soothe their insecurities, but you don't. Because explaining yourself now feels like shrinking, like bending your truth to fit into someone else's comfort, like abandoning yourself just to maintain a fragile peace. So instead of explaining, you breathe. Instead of arguing, you observe. Instead of defending, you detach. But this detachment is not cold. It is compassionate. It is the kind of compassion that understands every soul moves at its own pace, sees at its own depth, awakens in its own time. And you begin to understand the quiet wisdom of the strong. They do not explain themselves, because they have learned that explanation does not create understanding. It only creates dependency, resentment, or distortion. Understanding must come from within. And so, you walk this tightrope between caring deeply and acting lightly, between knowing more and saying less, between wanting to help and needing to protect your energy. This conflict becomes your teacher. It teaches you when to speak with intention and when silence is the louder truth. It teaches you when to stay soft and when to step back. It teaches you when to hold space and when to close the door. And slowly, you begin to realize that strength is not loud, not reactive, not eager to correct or convince. Strength is the ability to hold your truth without needing the world to bow to it. But the cost of this strength, the cost of holding wisdom without forcing it on others, begins to build inside you, creating a pressure that can only lead to one thing: collapse. Not a destructive collapse, but a necessary one. The breaking point where the emotional, mental, and spiritual weight you've been carrying finally becomes too heavy to hold alone. And that collapse, that overwhelming moment of inner exhaustion, is where we must go next. And then, almost without warning, the collapse arrives not as destruction, not as chaos, but as a quiet, unraveling from within, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't announce itself loudly, but seeps into the corners of your mind, soft and relentless. It is the moment when awareness becomes too heavy, when silence becomes too sharp, when the inner world you've been carrying finally demands to be acknowledged. You find yourself tired in a way sleep cannot fix, tired of seeing too much, tired of holding back your truth, tired of walking through a world where your clarity is mistaken for coldness, your boundaries for cruelty, your silence for surrender. This collapse doesn't look dramatic from the outside. To others, you appear calm, functional, composed, perhaps even more peaceful than usual. But inside, you feel the slow cracking of the emotional armor you've worn for years, the subtle trembling of a soul that has carried too much responsibility, too much empathy, too much vigilance. It feels like standing at the edge of an ocean you've been trying to hold back with your bare hands, wave after wave after wave, crashing into you until your strength finally gives way. There is a moment, late at night, when the world is asleep and you are wide awake, staring into the dim ceiling, feeling the weight of every unspoken word, every misinterpretation you've endured, every time you bit your tongue to protect someone else's comfort. And in that moment, the collapse doesn't scare you, it relieves you, because you realize you are human, and humans were not built to carry insight like a permanent burden. You feel your mind drifting through memories, moments you stayed silent instead of defending yourself, moments you forgave without being asked, moments you understood someone's pain even as they blamed you for it, moments you sacrificed your own emotional well-being just to prevent conflict. Piece by piece, your body starts remembering everything you forced yourself to tolerate, and your heart begins to ache not from weakness, but from the sheer amount of strength you've been forced to embody alone. This collapse feels like being underwater, not drowning, but suspended, weightless, unable to tell which way is up. You feel disconnected from yourself, from others, from your purpose. You question whether your silence is wisdom or avoidance, whether your boundaries are strength or isolation, whether your detachment is peace or numbness. You feel your emotions swelling like a tide, grief, anger, fatigue, tenderness, clarity, all rising at once, blurring into a single overwhelming force. You might find yourself withdrawing even further, not because you want to, but because your heart is overloaded. Conversations feel heavy. Noise feels unbearable. Expectations feel suffocating. You notice yourself becoming quieter, slower, softer, as if your soul is begging you to stop carrying so much. And as the collapse deepens, your mind becomes a battlefield of metaphors. Your thoughts feel like tangled strings, your emotions like overgrown forests, your spirit like a bird unsure whether to fly or retreat into its nest. You begin to feel everything all at once and nothing at all, a paradox of sensation that leaves you drifting in a fog you cannot explain. And yet, strangely, this collapse is not your defeat, it is your turning point. Because collapses are not signs of weakness. They are signs that the old self is shedding. The version of you that bent to please others cannot survive this collapse. The version that over-explained cannot survive it. The version that tolerated disrespect cannot survive it. The version that carried everyone else's emotional weight cannot survive it. This collapse tears away the layers of you that were built from fear, guilt, pressure, and self-sacrifice. It forces you to stop, to feel, to listen to yourself. For the first time, you are not explaining yourself to the world. You are explaining yourself to yourself. And it is in this collapse, this quiet emotional implosion, that you realize something profound. You cannot keep living as the person who swallows their truth. You cannot keep giving pieces of yourself to people who misunderstand your heart. You cannot keep holding responsibilities that were never yours to carry. You cannot keep shrinking just to make others comfortable. And as this truth settles in your bones, the collapse shifts slowly, gently, from a breaking to a rebirth. You realize the collapse was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to strip away everything that kept you from your own liberation. And from this raw, vulnerable place, a new awareness begins to rise, one that will lead you toward revelation, toward clarity, toward a softer and stronger way of existing. This is where the next chapter begins. The revelation that transforms your silence, from heaviness into freedom, your boundaries from walls into guidance, your detachment from numbness into wisdom, and from the quiet wreckage of your collapse, something unexpected begins to rise, not loudly, not triumphantly, but gently, like dawn light slipping through curtains after a long and sleepless night. This is the revelation. The moment your soul begins stitching itself back together with threads made not of duty or guilt, but of clarity, boundaries, and truth. You start to feel a subtle shift, a soft rearranging of your inner world, as if life itself is whispering a lesson you were always meant to learn. You were never meant to carry everything. You realize that silence was never your weakness. It was your wisdom protecting you before you had the words to protect yourself. You realize that your collapse was not a failure, it was a cleansing, a necessary dismantling of the self you built from survival instead of authenticity. And slowly, piece by piece, you begin to understand what strength truly is. Strength is not explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. Strength is not shrinking your truth for people who fear their own. Strength is choosing peace even when chaos invites you to dance. Strength is saying no without apologizing, walking away without defending, and trusting that your intentions do not require validation to be real. You begin to see that boundaries are not walls, they are doors that you control, openings you choose, spaces you curate with intention. You realize you are allowed to decide who has access to your time, your energy, your emotions, your heart. You no longer justify why you need rest, why you choose distance, why you protect your peace. Instead, you honor yourself quietly, effortlessly, without theatrics. And a new kind of confidence begins to grow within you, the kind that doesn't need to be announced, the kind that doesn't require applause, the kind that sits in your chest like warmth on a cold morning. You start to understand that awareness isn't meant to isolate you, it's meant to refine you. You learn to see without absorbing, to understand without intervening, to empathize without losing yourself in someone else's storm. You begin to engage with life consciously rather than compulsively. When someone projects their fear onto you, you don't absorb it. When someone invites you into chaos, you don't accept the invitation. When someone demands explanations, you offer silence, not as avoidance, but as self-respect. You start to understand why strong people don't explain themselves, because explanation is often an attempt to be seen by someone who has already decided to look away. Because explanation is often a plea to be understood by someone who hears only through the echo of their own insecurities. Because explanation, when forced, becomes self-betrayal. And so you begin to let go, not of people, not of memories, but of the old reflex that told you your truth needed permission. You release the need to convince, the need to justify, the need to defend, the need to soften your edges for the comfort of others. And in doing so, life begins to feel lighter. Conversations become clearer, relationships become healthier, your inner world becomes calmer. You start choosing when to speak and when to stay silent, not out of fear, but out of discernment. You start recognizing who deserves access to your heart and who only seeks access to your energy. You start realizing that you don't need to prove your goodness to anyone who cannot see it, nor your intentions to anyone who twists them. And perhaps the most powerful revelation of all, you learn to accept misunderstanding. You learn to let people misinterpret your silence, your boundaries, your choices, because you finally understand that their interpretation is a reflection of them, not you. And for the first time in your life, you feel free. Free from the chains of approval. Free from the weight of expectation. Free from the endless cycle of explaining yourself to people who do not even explain themselves to themselves. This revelation doesn't make life easier, but it makes you clearer, stronger, softer, in the right ways, sharper in the places that matter. You begin to walk differently, grounded, intentional, steady. People notice your presence, not because it is loud, but because it is unmistakably whole. And now, with this revelation rooted inside you, you are ready for the final transformation, the integration, the moment when awareness becomes wisdom, strength becomes peace, and silence becomes a language of stillness, truth, and self-trust. You see, somewhere in the quiet aftermath of collapse, when the echoes of your own thoughts finally tire themselves out, something unexpected begins to rise within you, not as a shout, not as a revelation carved in lightning, but as a soft, almost embarrassed whisper. It's the kind of whisper you might overlook if you were still busy fighting the world. But now, in the hush that follows exhaustion, you hear it. It says, "You don't have to carry everything." And at first, you reject it because you've built your life on the idea that strength means endurance, that being awake means being responsible for everything you see, everything you sense, everything you understand. But the whisper repeats, not to persuade you, but to remind you of something you've forgotten. Not every burden that enters your awareness belongs in your arms. You start to notice how much of your suffering came not from the world itself, but from the instinct to constantly interfere, constantly adjust, constantly explain your intentions to people who weren't even listening. You begin to see that awareness without boundaries becomes a curse, that empathy without limits becomes erosion, that sensitivity without direction becomes self-harm. And then, one unremarkable morning, perhaps while brushing your teeth or stepping outside into air that feels fresher than usual, you realize that your collapse was not the end. It was a clearing, a necessary fall that stripped away everything false, everything excessive, everything you were never meant to hold. This is the beginning of revelation. The moment you understand that strength isn't loud, strength isn't desperate, strength isn't a frantic attempt to be understood. Strength is quiet alignment with what truly matters. Strength is choosing where your energy goes. Strength is knowing when to speak and when silence honors you more. Strength is the refusal to set yourself on fire just to prove warmth. And as this revelation deepens, you begin to look back at your old patterns, the way a traveler sees an abandoned campsite, recognizable, familiar, but no longer a place you belong. You remember all the times you explained yourself to people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. You remember the exhaustion of defending your intentions to minds closed long before you opened your mouth. You remember the invisible weight of being the emotional translator for everyone around you, decoding motives, softening harsh truths, carrying the emotional temperature of every room you walked into. You see now that your silence was never the problem. It was your belief that silence made you weak. And slowly, a new truth settles into your bones, steady and unshakable. Strong people don't explain themselves, not because they're arrogant, not because they're cold, and not because they're unaffected, but because they've realized that explanation is rarely about clarity. It is usually about permission. And you don't need permission to be who you are, to see what you see, to feel what you feel. Explanation becomes unnecessary the moment you stop trying to convince others that your perspective is valid. You begin to understand that most people don't hear you through your words. They hear you through their wounds, their fears, their projections. And no amount of explanation can heal what someone refuses to confront within themselves. So you stop trying to curate their perception of you. You stop trying to correct misunderstandings that were born from someone else's insecurity. You stop pouring your truth into vessels too cracked to hold anything real. Instead, you quietly redirect your energy toward what nourishes you, what expands you, what honors the depth you've always carried. And in this subtle shift, something remarkable happens. Your inner world becomes peaceful, not empty, not numb, not withdrawn, peaceful. The same awareness that once overwhelmed you becomes a compass. The same sensitivity that once tore you apart becomes intuition. The same depth that once isolated you becomes grounding. You realize that you don't need to dim yourself to fit into shallow spaces. You don't need to justify your silence. You don't need to announce your boundaries like warnings. You simply live them. And, as you do, the world rearranges itself. People who thrive on chaos stop seeking you out because they no longer find fuel in you. People who misunderstand you drift away because misunderstanding requires engagement, and you no longer offer yours. People who value depth gravitate toward you because your steadiness becomes magnetic. You no longer chase connection. It arrives naturally, effortlessly, like tide returning to shore. And in this, you learn the simplest, most liberating truth of all. Strength is not in explaining yourself. Strength is in knowing yourself. Strength is in living from the quiet confidence that your truth doesn't need an audience. It only needs alignment. And this realization prepares you for the final integration, where everything you've seen, everything you've endured, everything you've discovered begins to settle like dust in a sunbeam, soft, gentle, and exactly where it belongs. And so now, as we move into the final arc of this journey, you stand at the quiet threshold of integration, where wisdom stops being something you chase and becomes something you embody. Here, there is no dramatic music, no thunderous revelation, no cosmic sign. Instead, there is a soft, steady, returning to yourself. Like a river, finally rejoining the ocean it has been moving toward its entire life. You begin to understand that life was never asking you to be invincible, only present. Never asking you to be perfect, only honest. Never asking you to explain yourself, only to know yourself deeply enough that explanations become unnecessary. Integration feels like a gentle exhale after years of holding your breath without realizing it. You stop solving every moment and start experiencing it. You stop decoding every expression and start trusting your intuition. You stop meeting people where they are and start meeting yourself where you are. And slowly, life begins to soften around you. The world no longer feels like an arena where you must constantly defend your being. Instead, it becomes a landscape you move through with quiet certainty, knowing that your strength is no longer in how well you endure, but in how well you choose. People will still misunderstand you from time to time, but now you simply let it be. You no longer fear being misread because you no longer define yourself through the eyes of others. You no longer chase closure or validation because the only validation you ever truly needed was the permission to trust your own experience. And that, at last, is something you give yourself freely. You no longer contort yourself to fit expectations. You no longer shrink to avoid intimidating others. You no longer offer explanations like apologies. Instead, you respond to life with intentionality. You speak when it aligns with truth, not obligation. You act when it aligns with purpose, not pressure. You walk away when your soul grows quiet, signaling that your presence no longer belongs in a certain room. This is the calm strength that cannot be performed, only lived. And from this space, something beautiful happens. You begin to reconnect with others, but more importantly, with yourself. Not from desperation or fear, but from resonance. Conversations feel lighter. Relationships feel clearer. Solitude feels nourishing. You realize that the loneliness you once feared was never the absence of people, it was the absence of self-trust. And now, that trust is here, sturdy and unshakable, holding you upright from within. Integration becomes a kind of homecoming. You no longer run from your depth. You no longer resent your perception. You no longer fear your own sensitivity. Instead, you allow them to guide you. You see now that your strength was never in being understood. Your strength was in understanding yourself so deeply that misunderstanding no longer threatens you. You see now that your voice was never meant to be spent on convincing the unwilling. It was meant to align with truth, not approval. You see now that your energy is sacred, and where it flows, your life follows. Strong people don't explain themselves, not because they are distant or unreachable, but because strength is clarity, and clarity does not argue. It does not chase. It does not plead. Clarity simply is. And you, after everything, have earned yours. So you carry it with grace. You carry it with quiet confidence. You carry it with the same steady presence that trees carry their rings, proof of storms endured, sunlight absorbed, and a rootedness that requires no explanation. And at the end of this long, winding reflection, there is one final paradox waiting for you, the same one that opened this entire journey. The more deeply you know yourself, the less you need the world to know you. The more rooted you become, the less you search for ground outside yourself. The more honest you are with your inner world, the less you fear the misunderstandings of the outer one. Strength has never been about appearing unbreakable. It has always been about knowing what is worth breaking yourself over and what is not. It has always been about choosing when to speak and when silence protects your peace. It has always been about recognizing that your voice is precious, and not every space deserves to hear it. And so you walk forward, not louder, but clearer. Not harder, but softer in the right places. Not guarded, but selective. And in this final moment of integration, you understand the deepest truth of all. You do not rise by explaining yourself. You rise by being yourself. Fully, quietly, consistently, authentically. And that is the kind of strength the world feels long before it understands.